Tonight, the ceasefire expires. The two-week truce between the United States and Iran, fragile, repeatedly violated, and barely held together by diplomatic urgency, runs out in hours. Vance has canceled his flight to Islamabad. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are back in Washington for emergency consultations. Iran's foreign ministry says it has no intention of sending negotiators to a second round of talks. President Trump told CNBC this morning that he expects bombing, adding that a harder line would be a better attitude. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is on the phone with anyone who will answer. And in the background of all of this, Saudi Arabia, the country that entered this war insisting on neutrality, has executed a sequence of strategic moves so large, so structurally permanent, that the balance of power in the Middle East has quietly shifted. Almost nobody is describing it as a single story. To understand what Saudi Arabia did and why Iran's leverage is shrinking by the day, we have to start at the beginning. February 28, 2026, Operation Epic Fury. At approximately a.m. Tehran time, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes across Iran. Military facilities, nuclear sites, and leadership infrastructure were hit. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. Senior officials and ERG commanders were removed from the chain of command. Government facilities were struck. Iran was stunned, briefly leaderless, and immediately cornered. Within hours, the response began. Hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles were launched toward Israel and U.S. bases in Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And then Iran did what it had threatened to do for decades. It closed the Strait of Hormuz, not symbolically, operationally. Fast boats attacked merchant vessels. Naval mines were deployed into the shipping lanes. Major carriers Maersk, CMA-CGM, Hapag-Lloyd suspended transit. By March 2nd, commercial tankers were no longer broadcasting automatic identification system signals in the strait. War risk insurance clauses were triggered. The corridor went dark. The Strait of Hormuz is 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Through those two unidirectional sea lanes flows roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day, about 20% of global seaborne crude trade. Every barrel exported by Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the way heading to Asia passes through those waters. 84% of Hormuz traffic is Asia-bound. China receives roughly one-third of its oil through that choke point. Japan depends on it almost entirely. South Korea, India, Southeast Asia, all dependent on a 34-kilometer corridor that one country just shut down. The global economy reacted instantly. This was not a refinery outage or a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. It was the largest oil supply shock on record triggered by war, and Saudi Arabia's entire export model, its decade-long positioning as the world's reliable energy stabilizer under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, was suddenly placed under direct threat. That is when Saudi Arabia began moving, not militarily, strategically. Move 1, the oil surge. Before the bombs fell, Saudi Arabia read the intelligence. In the first 24 days of February 2026, Saudi crude shipments climbed to 7.3 million barrels per day, the highest level since April 2023. Riyadh was prepositioning exports. Tankers were filled and dispatched before the strait closed. Crude was moved out of the Gulf while the shipping lanes were still technically open. That pre-war surge created a buffer. It bought global markets weeks of breathing room. It reduced the immediate panic spike in oil pricing. It preserved Saudi Arabia's reputation as the indispensable supplier at the exact moment the world needed one. Move 2, the Petroline pivot. When Iran closed Hormuz, Saudi Arabia activated its bypass, the East-West pipeline, known as Petroline, built in the 1980s to circumvent exactly this scenario. The 1,200-kilometer pipeline runs from the Abqaiq processing complex near the Gulf Coast westward to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Saudi Arabia quadrupled crude shipments from Red Sea terminals. By early April, Petroline, with a design capacity of 7 million barrels per day, was operating at maximum throughput. Yanbu became the most important oil export terminal in the world, not Houston, not Rotterdam. Yanbu, and then Iran responded on April 8th. Within hours of Trump announcing the two-week ceasefire, Iran launched its largest coordinated attack on Gulf energy infrastructure since the war began. A Petroline pumping station was struck, reducing throughput by approximately 700,000 barrels per day, about 10% of Saudi export capacity at that moment. Simultaneously, Iranian drones hit refineries and processing facilities in Jubail, Ras Tanura, Yanbu, and Riyadh, the Manifa offshore oil field producing. Roughly 300,000 barrels per day was hit. The Quraysh onshore complex, another 300,000 barrels per day was struck. In one coordinated attack, Iran removed roughly 600,000 barrels per day of Saudi production and 700,000 barrels per day of pipeline capacity. The strategic logic was clear. If Iran could break Petroline, Saudi Arabia could not compensate for Hormuz. Without compensation, global oil prices would spike uncontrollably. Brent would surge past $100 per barrel. The S&P 500 would drop. American consumers would see $7 gasoline. Domestic political pressure in Washington would mount. Iran's leverage through Hormuz would be magnified by pipeline damage. It was a rational calculation. Saudi Arabia answered in 4 days. By April 12, Saudi Aramco announced Petroline was fully restored. Manifa was back online. Curie repairs were underway. Production resumed at near normal levels, for days, under active wartime conditions. That speed was not just an engineering achievement. It was a message. Whatever you destroy, we will repair faster. Then you can break it, and your leverage through Hormuz diminishes every day the world adapts. Because the more the world routes around Hormuz through Petroline, through Abu Dhabi's pipeline, through Iraqi overland corridors, the less Iran earns. Saudi exports continue, Iran's oil revenue collapses. Hormuz shifts from strategic asset to strategic liability. Move 3, King Fahd Air Base. In the early weeks of the war, Saudi Arabia maintained formal neutrality. Riyadh refused to allow its territory or airspace to be used for offensive strikes against Iran. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who had brokered diplomatic normalization with Tehran through China in March 2023, was not prepared to become a launchpad for attacks on a neighboring Muslim state. Then Iran struck Riyadh, then Jubail, then Ras Tanura, then Yanbu, then Petroline, within hours of a ceasefire meant to reduce escalation, and Saudi Arabia recalculated. According to Wall Street Journal reporting citing officials familiar with the decision, Riyadh granted U.S. forces access to King Fahd Air Base in Taif on the Red Sea coast. This base sits outside the immediate Gulf strike zone. It allows American strike aircraft, refueling operations, and intelligence missions to operate from the western side of the Arabian Peninsula. It protects Yanbu and the Red Sea export corridor. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was structural integration into U.S. war planning. Saudi Arabia had not allowed this level of American operational access since 1991. The decision was made quietly, no press conference, no triumphant announcement, but it signaled that Riyadh concluded neutrality was no longer viable if Iran continued targeting its infrastructure. Yet here is the second pivot, the complexity that prevents this from being a simple story of alignment. Saudi Arabia is simultaneously pushing Washington to preserve the diplomatic track. It has urged inclusion of Lebanon in ceasefire discussions. It is working with Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey to maintain dialogue channels with Tehran. It has not severed bilateral communication with Iran. Saudi Arabia is not fighting this war for regime change. Its objective is narrower and more strategic. Dismantle Iran's nuclear weapons capability, constrain its missile program, reopen Hormuz permanently, and reduce Iranian influence while preserving a functioning Iranian state that does not collapse into something worse. Now consider the physical bottleneck. 230 very large crude carriers remain trapped inside the Persian Gulf. Each carries approximately 2 million barrels. Collectively, roughly 460 million barrels sit idle enough to supply the United States for about 25 days or China for about 45 days. These ships incurred demurrage costs between $30,000 and $100,000 per day. 8 weeks of blockade multiplied across 230 vessels translates into billions in financial losses. During a brief mid-April window when partial transit appeared possible, 6 vessels exited, 3 VLCCs including a Liberia-flagged vessel chartered by Thailand's PTT and 2 Chinese-flagged tankers chartered by Sinopec departed through a trial corridor negotiated by Malaysia. 7 ships cleared out of 230. Meanwhile, LNG exports from Qatar, representing about 20% of global supply, remain constrained. Sulfur, helium, aluminum, polymers, resins, ammonia, LPG, the industrial building blocks of fertilizer and manufacturing, remain disrupted. The International Crisis Group warns that even after reopening, it may take months for specialized facilities to restart and for shipping insurance markets to normalize. If the Houthis open a second front in the Red Sea targeting rerouted tankers from Yanbu, the dual choke point disruption could exceed modern oil market absorption capacity. Now follow the chain. If the ceasefire expires tonight and is not renewed, U.S. bombing resumes. Iran recloses Hormuz entirely. Brent crude climbs from $96 to $110, $120, potentially $130 to $150. At $130 Brent, analysts project a 12 to 15% S&P 500 correction within 60 days. Gasoline hits $8 or $9 per gallon. Central banks face a new supply-driven inflation shock they cannot manage through rate adjustments. Energy importing nations in Africa and South Asia face fiscal crises. This is not speculation. These are modeled scenarios cited privately by officials and analysts. Iran's internal situation compounds the pressure. Ali Khamenei is dead. Mojtaba Khamenei, elevated March 8 thunder bombardment, has never held executive authority. His legitimacy is fragile. The regime is managing domestic unrest following the January 2026 crackdown that killed thousands. Nuclear infrastructure has been struck by B-2 bombers. IAEA oversight is absent. Oil exports are squeezed by both Hormuz closure and U.S. blockade of Iranian ports. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf rejected U.S. talks on March 29, then attended 21 hours of direct negotiations in Islamabad. That shift alone signals internal pressure. Iran's state media blames U.S. greed and contradictions for failed talks but does not rule out future negotiations. It says the conditions are not right yet. That is bargaining language. Saudi Arabia understands this better than anyone because it has absorbed the cost of this war and repaired under fire. The kingdom has fired interceptors daily for 8 weeks. It restored pipeline capacity in 4 days. It integrated American air power quietly. It continues pushing for a Lebanon ceasefire. It maintains diplomatic channels. Every move tightens Iran's strategic box, and tonight the box either opens through negotiation or closes through escalation, if Iraqi boards a plane to Islamabad. Within hours, diplomacy continues. Hormuz reopens gradually. Tankers move. Oil drops towards $75. A nuclear framework begins forming. If Iran refuses, if ERG hardliners prevail, if Hormuz remains locked and toll mandates advance, then U.S. bombers lift from King Fahd Air Base, oil surges, markets fall, the war expands, deal or bombs, diplomacy or destruction, Iraqi in Islamabad by midnight, or strike packages airborne by morning, the clock is running.